Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're here today with Jennifer Heighton, and she is a teacher in the British Columbia school system. And she's here to talk to us today about what's happening in with COVID and other things about what's happening in the BC school systems. Thank you for joining us today, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being willing to talk with us. And we just want to know somewhat about what is it like teaching in the schools with the COVID rules?
It is, I would say it's complicated. You know, it's a completely different way of how we've been teaching before, but we understand this is what needs to happen to keep us all safe. So we definitely have shifted and adjusted to make it work. Mm-hmm. So some of the things we're doing is, the students have to line up. We try to keep them distanced as much as we can, although 2 meters apart, even like if they're lined up outside, would stretch them all the way down the field. So that's not going to happen. And so 1 meter apart is if we're lucky. And then hand washing, lots of that going on. If we have desks, we spread them apart. Some classrooms don't have desks, though. They have tables because we had moved to more of a collaborative learning style. And so some teachers had already gotten rid of the individualized desks. My class does still have individual desks. I used to have them pushed together, but now they are spread apart into rows. But the teachers that have tables or kind of pods, they've had to, it's been harder for them to get to distance the kids when the furniture isn't quite open to distancing. So there's that. And then strategies that we use, like we used to do a lot more collaborative group work, and we can't do that as much with the COVID protocols. You don't want the kids sitting close together and talking to each other. So it's better if it's more distanced type of activities, which can be complicated and not quite as rich a learning style as what we're used to.
Okay. Has this affected grades any, or the students' ability to learn?
Yeah, it's affected the ability to, like, in terms of how much curriculum you can cover. Mm-hmm. It's not, we haven't been able to get through the curriculum quite as quickly this year. And so, but I think the big picture thing that people should take with them is the fact that we are in a global pandemic. And so if we quite get through the curriculum this year, that's just how it works with all the protocols, because we have to take so much more time to do the health check in the morning where we ask them questions, washing their hands several times a day. So making sure that they follow all the protocols has cut into curriculum time. So it has been trickier that way too, that, you do your best, but it's been a challenge, I would say. And then I know for high schools, like I teach in elementary, but high schools, they've had it even more challenging because a lot of them switched to a quarter system instead of semester, which semester system, they would have had 4 courses. And if they're not semester, they had 8 courses at a time, like 8 classes. But in the quarter system, there's only 2 classes in a term, and they just do these really short terms of 10 weeks each. So they're doing like a full course in 10 weeks and only 2 of them. And that was so that there wouldn't be as much mixing of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means, though, is the students have to get the entire course. So imagine the full year of math crammed into 10 weeks, or a full year worth of writing crammed into 10 weeks. It means that the kids have a lot more concepts to cover in that short time.
Right.
And the work getting done, they might have a longer, the whole afternoon to do that course, but it is more challenging. Like, what if they miss a couple of days? What if they're sick or something and they miss a few days or even a week or two because of COVID? Then that's like a good chunk of the course that they've missed, and a lot of concepts. So it has been challenging that way too, curriculum-wise, for both elementary and for secondary.
Yeah. 10 weeks, as I remember my university days, that was one of the big adjustments in your first year of university, was leaving high school where you had like a whole year or so to pick up a concept. Now you only have like a couple weeks to grab it and be able to test on it and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's
yes.
I can imagine for say a 14 or 15-year-old to have to jump to that sort of thing. That's got to be a struggle.
It is, definitely, especially when sometimes you're dealing with concepts like for math, for example, grade 10 math. There's a lot of tricky concepts in those upper grades, and
mm-hmm.
just even missing a couple of those classes can, especially when it's the entire afternoon, can be daunting.
Yeah.
To try to catch up on. Yes.
So you said that you were using in the elementary school, using a more collaborative way of learning. I assuming that means more discussions and more group activities, but you're saying you had to veer away from that in your own classroom.
Yes. Yes, and if I've managed to do some of them outside, so you do the teaching inside, mm-hmm. and then sometimes they can take it outside to do it, but that's very weather dependent, which means that in the wintertime, when the fall and winter, when it got rainier, I couldn't do it as much. I'm hoping that with better weather, we'll be able to do a little bit more outside. But then, there's other kids playing on the playground, which is distracting and things like that.
Yeah.
It's not always ideal. When the health officer says, "Oh, just teach outside," they're not imagining that in a school with 14 divisions, like 14 classes, you can't all take them outside at the same time. There's limited places out there that you can take them without being distracted. And you can't all be like, doing a lesson at the same time outside.
I imagine this is like, and that it becomes quite literal. Oh, look, teacher's squirrel.
Exactly. Yes.
It's like it doesn't necessarily have to be, say, Bobby climbing over the jumping gym. It could be literally a squirrel just ran through the middle between you and the students, and it's like, oh, look, now I'm going to pay attention to the squirrel. How do you get their attention back once they've been distracted?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And when you're outside and there's several classes out there, or there's cars coming down the street, or whichever, it is a bit more distracting than when you're in the classroom. However, we are going to, just do the best we can. It's
mm-hmm.
just, when the powers that be think, oh, they can just take them outside. There's a lot more to it than that. I don't think they really think about the realities of it.
Yeah.
And in an elementary school, it can be a little bit easier in terms of the outside part, because there's a lot of rich things you can do when you're outdoors. But let's say if you are teaching secondary history, or writing, it's composition. You're not going to be able to do as much outside as you can inside. So
Yeah.
a science class could go outside, but
Yeah, I was going to say a science class. It probably lends itself to, hey, let's look at what the bugs are doing or how the plants are growing or something like that, and you can have them be, or the squirrel running through. Then it becomes a hey, exciting idea. What about the squirrel, right? But there's other subjects that it doesn't lend itself as easily to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas and in elementary, there's a lot of things like that you could work with. Whereas in high school, the curriculum for science, for example, is quite structured. So not all activities will lend to being able to be done outdoors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
now, with the COVID protocol, go ahead.
No, go ahead. With the COVID protocol, yeah.
Yeah, COVID protocols, it varies between school to school, right, in terms of what the state of the building is, for example. So I've been lucky in that the school that I work at, I can open the windows and we can get pretty good airflow going. But there are other schools around the province where the windows don't open. And so those students and teachers are in these classrooms where nobody is distanced, because when you give the occupancy rate of up to 30 students plus a teacher, it's far exceeded what an actual, like even a store would be allowed. So like a clothing store, for example, would not be allowed to have that many people packed into it and the same square footage as a classroom does. So ventilation, I think, is super important, and that is something that has not been dealt with much at all, with, the ministry making sure that any classroom without windows has something instead, like an air cleaner, a portable air cleaner, or those kinds of things. Some schools, they've been able to upgrade their HEPA filters systems in their HVAC systems, but not all HVAC systems can take a MERV 13 filter. A lot of the older ones can't. The highest they might get is maybe a MERV 8 or something a little bit higher, but not 13. So, for schools like mine where I can open the windows and at least have control over my ventilation, that is good. But ones that don't have as much control or can't open windows, those are the rooms that I would worry about. And I really think it should be addressed. Yeah.
Ventilation is something that has been talked about. Dr. Tedros and Dr. Ryan and Dr. Kirchhoff of the WHO have, right from there, have said that the schools need to be ventilated somehow or another. And as you said, the simplest way is to open a window, right? But is that something that trying to understand the school system itself, is that something that has to come from the ministry, or is that something that comes from the school district? Because there's so many different parts that bring together a school.
That's true. There are. You're right. So who's responsible for what is a big issue that we've been having to navigate, I would say. I would say that the government, which is the ministry, is responsible for setting, the guidelines, and then the districts are responsible for carrying them out. Now, the issue, though, is that BC public education has been underfunded for almost 20 years now. The budgets have been slashed ever since Christy Clark came in and kind of started whittling away at the budget, and the NDP who've come in after them haven't really increased it by that much. So we're still about $1,800 behind the national average per child than the rest of Canada. So that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Like for a school like mine, it like $600,000 a year that the school is shortchanged compared to students in other provinces like Alberta or Ontario. So $1,800, so $600,000, over $500,000. Like how many extra teachers would that pay for, which would mean smaller classes or extra help, like more counseling time or library time or learning support time. That really makes a difference. And so because it's been shortchanged for so long, there's been a lot of areas that districts have been forced to cut budgets in. So some of it's been maintenance, right? So in terms of how the building operates, they've done the best with what they've been given. And so, but the thing is, it's been 20 years of stringent budgets. And so that adds up. So then when you have a pandemic like this, all of a sudden, boom, there are classes, like I said, that have poor ventilation, and that's never been addressed. And all of a sudden now it's important. And this is where the ministry at the beginning of this pandemic, or even this summer, should have set aside extra money to deal with that. Should have said, we're going to give districts like more than just the basics that they gave. So they gave $45.6 million to districts for pandemic costs. Now you would think that that's a lot of money, but when you think that there's 500,000 children going to school that are school aged, 550,000 to be exact, then that $45.6 million actually doesn't stretch very far, especially because we had to hire daytime custodians, because that was another thing that over the 20 years got cut over the years. A lot of schools had lost some daytime custodians, and now that more cleaning had to happen, they had to hire more. So a good bunch of that $45.6 million that the government gave for pandemic costs went towards that, and there was none left for ventilation. I mean, some districts managed to scrape some together and put in a few more MERV 13 filters and that kind of thing, but it's not really, there wasn't enough. There wasn't enough funding, and that's key, and that is a government responsibility. Like, I don't think the districts were given enough to work with. They're doing what they can with what they were given, but it definitely could have been better. What the government gave, yes. Especially considering our starting point. We were starting with 20 years of underfunded buildings and staffing, and then all of a sudden, boom, pandemic, and now you need more cleaning, you need more this, you need more that, and there's not enough in the budget to deal with all that.
Well, I would think that that we're talking, was it 14 million, right? That would just be a good start in upgrading you to bringing you towards the 20 years that you are already behind. That would just be a good start to that. And now you're talking about what would be an emergency thing. There's no way that would cover it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, what they and because the school system, I mean, when you think about it, schools, they are educating an entire generation. Like, we are servicing an entire generation of the population, 5 days a week, 10 months a year. So, you think of, okay, other public services that are out there, let's say in the medical community, for example, you only see your doctor like a couple times a year, your dentist a few times a year,
Mm-hmm.
and not for an entire day. So, but whereas the school system is yes, it is a huge expense, but I would say it's an investment because you're servicing an entire generation of kids to be hopefully contributing citizens of society.
Yeah.
And so putting the money in is worth it in the long run. And so I just think the nickel and diming that goes on when it comes to education is pretty bad, especially considering other provinces are spending more
Mm-hmm.
on their students than BC does.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I think that people, especially some of the government officials, I remember now. I'm going to age myself a little bit here. I remember when I was in elementary school, the computer was attached to this huge mainframe thing, and it would never be in a school. To where when I left high school, they had the very first home computers sitting where the school was able to buy a handful of these home computers, and to what we have today. And it was all about investment. We wouldn't be where we are today with technology if there wasn't investment into the educational system. And to let it lag behind, what could our students of today be doing tomorrow to make a better world for us, right?
Yeah.
It really is that simple, isn't it?
It is, very much so. I mean, all of these children are going to be our future lawyers, doctors, nurses, dentists, accountants. Like, they're going to be working in all aspects of society, and so why not develop them to the best potential that they can reach? I think that those years from K to 12 are really important, and I think public education as a whole is something that governments should not be looking at as an expense, but more as an investment. And in the last 20 years, that attitude has been more like it's an expense, and that has to change, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you're a wonderful teacher, and I wish my kids would have had you. You have some brilliant ideas, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you. And thank you for feeling comfortable and coming on to our show and our podcast to talk about what's actually going on with the schools. Because you've said more than what is just happening with the pandemic. You've actually addressed some long-term things that maybe as a society we need to look at with our public school system.
I would hope so. Yes,
Yeah.
I definitely hope so.
So again, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for listening to our teacher from the BC school system. All right.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and we'll do this in 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, so Jennifer said it really well that we need to place and invest our values into the school system, into our children. They are our future, and without them, humanity's kind of sunk, and we need them to be educated so they can take us to greater things. We have dreams and aspirations for reaching out into the stars and for curing great diseases and understanding how life became about, and without our youth, and without educating them and teaching them what we have learned so that they can move forward, the future of humanity is no more. We do need to impress upon our elected officials to support all education, not just private, not just public, but all education, so that our children can carry our hopes and dreams of our species into the future and out into our universe. So, with that, we had, over the past little while, we had the Liberal National Convention, and we also had the NDP National Convention. Since we had started with talking about British Columbia, the NDP National Convention was opened up by John Horgan, and let's hear what the NDP National Convention 2021 has to say.
NDP Premier of British Columbia, our friend John Horgan.
Greetings, friends. Premier John Horgan here, and I want to thank Mathieu Vic for that warm introduction, and it's great to be with New Democrats from coast to coast to coast. It's a real thrill to be here talking to you as a second-term NDP Premier. It is an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to implement the ideas and the values that all of us share right here in British Columbia, focusing on the needs of the people in my neighborhood, in my community, and in communities right across British Columbia. It's an honor and a privilege. I can't state that enough. And I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today about how I came to be here. How is it that the NDP got elected not once but twice to lead a progressive government at the farthest corner of Canada here on the west coast of this great country? Well, it started with a campaign in 2017 that focused on the needs of people. We decided we were going up against a multiple-term Liberal government that appeared to be on cruise control. I was a little-known leader of the opposition that apparently wasn't good enough to do the job, and the Liberals were doing what Liberals do. They were campaigning as New Democrats after running as Conservatives and governing as arch-Conservatives. And so we put forward a platform that focused on the needs of people. And with a little bit of luck and a couple of calls the right way, we were able to form a minority government with the Green Party caucus in 2017, and then we set about implementing our plan. We said we would have the most ambitious climate action plan in North America, and we delivered on that. We said we would introduce and pass the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we did that, the only province in the country to do so. We also said we needed to end the grizzly bear hunt, the just grotesque practice of rich people coming from somewhere else to shoot majestic animals for sport. We did that as well. We protected special parts of British Columbia to continue to expand on the work of the 1990s NDP governments, protecting those precious parts of BC, some of which are behind me right now. So what else did we do in that first term? Childcare, $10 a day childcare, urgent primary care centers in communities right across British Columbia. We launched an ambitious plan to build infrastructure in every corner of the province using community benefit agreements. What are community benefit agreements? They're agreements that allow unionized workers to get access to public dollars. I believe, New Democrats believe, if we're going to spend public money on improving public infrastructure, we should hire local people, we should hire local businesses, we should make sure that the apprenticeship programs are in place so that marginal populations, women, Indigenous people, and others can get into the trades. That's what community benefit agreements are all about. And they got a warm embrace by British Columbians when we announced them. And we're now building British Columbia with local hire, with local companies, and with apprenticeship programs for the next generation of skilled workers here in British Columbia. The list went on and on and on. And when we finally called the election last September at what was characterized as a lull in the pandemic, there were a whole host of questions about whether it was the right thing to do or not. We had come to the end of our relationship with the Green Caucus. It was important to say to British Columbians that if you wanted a government that was focused on you, now was the time to put in place a stable majority government for the next 4 years. It was a campaign like no other. In fact, the pandemic had turned everything upside down. All of our lives are different now than they were 12 months ago, and they will be different 12 months from now. But we were faced with a campaign that did not involve knocking on doors. So we had to be creative. We used Zoom technology. We used a whole host of different ways to connect and engage with voters. But more important than all of the tactics of the campaign, our platform was pretty simple. It was focused on the needs of people. The people at the top had had their government for 20 years. It was time for regular people, the folks that matter to us, to have a say in how their government was run. And they responded in large numbers, the largest numbers ever, to vote for New Democrats. I've said, as you know, that BC is filled with New Democrats. They just don't know it yet. Well, after the last election, we know we can quantify there's a lot of New Democrats in British Columbia. And I believe that Canada is filled with New Democrats. They just don't know it yet. And as we prepare the campaign that's ahead of us, either in the number of weeks or a number of months, we as New Democrats need to focus first and foremost on what matters to people. Not the people at the top, but everybody else. We need to build housing. We need to make sure that the things that matter to people are there for them. Reinvigorate our public health care system. Coming from COVID, we've now seen cavernous gaps in the services that we provide for people. New Democrats can fix that. A great example of New Democrats working together was Jagmeet Singh and I focused on a 1-2 punch when it came to sick pay. That's paid sick leave for vulnerable people who felt they could not risk losing their job and instead went to work when they were sick. Can't have that during a pandemic. So I took the fight to the Premier's table, and Jagmeet and the federal caucus took it to the House of Commons. And we were able to convince the federal Liberals to start not just campaigning like New Democrats, but acting like New Democrats. Sadly, the program's not as robust as it can or should be, but the elements are there because New Democrats spoke out. New Democrats have always been there to fight for people who need services, to fight for people who need help in their corner. That's what we've always done, and that's what we will always do. And in the months ahead, as we start planning for the next federal election, I encourage all delegates, as you go to your home communities, to talk to your neighbors, to talk to the people around you about the things that matter to them. That's the winning formula. Focusing on people, first, second, third, and fourth, always. What is it that we can do as a government, a progressive government, to meet the needs of populations that have not had support for the past number of years after successive Liberal and then Conservative and then Liberal and then Conservative again governments? Now is the time. Now is the time to elect a national NDP government, and we will only do that if we listen to people and put in place a program that matters to them. As you know, there are people across the country right now not paying attention to what I'm saying, not paying attention to New Democrats gathering to argue about the points that we always argue about. And that's a good thing. That's why we are a fresh and robust party, because we take these things head on. We argue with each other to come to the best possible outcomes. We need to talk about the things that matter to people. And that's what we need to get them off their couches and get them voting for New Democrats in the coming election campaign. In 2020, with our success, we elected the first governing caucus with a majority of women. 29 women were elected, 28 men. Fiercely proud of that because of policies and programs we put in place to encourage diverse candidates to come forward. The largest group of people of color and Indigenous members ever elected in this caucus. 7 millennials, a couple of 70-year-olds, and everyone in between. The diversity of the community is reflected in the BC NDP caucus. It's reflected in the BC NDP government. And only when we can start to represent and reflect the diversity of our communities will we be truly successful. And I know Jagmeet Singh is focused like a laser on making sure that all of the disparate parts of our country are brought together from coast to coast to coast. There's no place in our hearts for division between regions. There's no place in our hearts for the hate and the racism that we've seen as a result of COVID-19. Now is the time to come together, all of us as New Democrats, to say with a unified voice that the best way forward for Canada is to elect Jagmeet Singh and a collection of members of Parliament from every corner of the country that reflect that diversity that makes us so strong and makes us different and distinct from our friends to the south. There's a lot of heartache in our past as Canadians, and I do not step away from that for 1 minute. but it's the resilience of Canadians to overcome bad policy choices of our past, whether it be the internment of Japanese Canadians, the Chinese head tax, the turning away of the Komagata Maru here in Vancouver at the turn of the last century. Those are black marks on our history, but that is also a symbol of the resilience of Canadians, the resilience of all of us to come together, regardless of where we come from. I'm the son of an Irish immigrant, and I sit before you today as the Premier of British Columbia. Our stories are unique. Our stories are unique as our diversity. And I'm proud to be part of a party that has always said that we will not stand for intolerance. We will always say love to hate. We will always say, yes, we can, to those who say, no, we can't. Let's channel all of our Jack Laytons in the months ahead. Let's get behind Jagmeet Singh in the federal NDP and elect a government that will do what we're doing here in British Columbia. Listen to British Columbians, listen to those from Alberta, from Quebec, from the Northwest Territories, from Nunavut, from every part of this country, and bring together a coalition of the willing to make Canada the great country we all want it to be. That's what's before us today, friends. A federal convention to set the course for the next election campaign, where we must be successful if we're going to have the progressive agenda that we have all spent our lives focused on. Now is the time to focus on what our neighbors need. Now is the time to focus on communities, whatever community you come from. Go back home, talk to your neighbors, ask them what they want to see in the next NDP platform, and let's implement that. Let's bring childcare to every family in this country. Let's make sure that paid sick leave is a reality, not a fiction. Let's say to those parties that like to campaign as New Democrats, get out of the way. We're already here. And we don't just campaign like New Democrats. What we've demonstrated in British Columbia is you can govern like New Democrats as well. Progressive values, front and center, unapologetic. That's what people want. That's what we're delivering. Jagmeet Singh will do that as well. Enjoy the rest of your convention. It's been a real thrill to be here, even though it's been with a backdrop and those darn cherry blossoms. Haishka OCM from the traditional territory, the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nation.
Thank you, John Horgan, for that great message. I think we can all get behind that.
Okay, so we heard John Horgan talk about the things that he has done. He has come up with a $15 an hour minimum wage. He has accomplished the daycare goals that he set out for. He still hasn't, as we heard from our BC teacher, he still hasn't really accomplished what he set out to do with the BC schools. And are the children of British Columbia being left behind? And are the teachers left with little funding to bring the British Columbia students just to be able to make the grades so that they can help be part of the dynamic that is going to help end the great issues of our time with climate change and getting us away from things like fossil fuels and helping us achieve energy without fuel and a greener place and a green planet where we can thrive as a species. So let's move on, and the Liberal National Convention is going to be heard next, and we're going to listen to what they actually have to say in much the same way we listen to the NDP. Hold on.
Travaillons d'ardeur et que nous puissions continuer ensemble.
Absolutely, Mona. This has been an inspiring convention and one that we will not soon forget. And now, almost the moment that we've been waiting for, we will hear from our leader. But as we get ready to do that, I'm honored to introduce a very dear colleague of ours, the Member of Parliament for Beauséjour, Dominic LeBlanc. À toi, Don.
So thank you very, very much, Marcy. Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, fellow Liberals. I have the immense pleasure to speak briefly this evening and then introduce our leader and our Prime Minister. Let me begin by thanking all of you for participating, for attending sessions at this convention, for sharing your ideas and your passion for Canada. I've been lucky enough to be attending conventions like these. Obviously, this is our first virtual one, but I've been lucky enough to be attending conventions like these since I was a young Liberal or a young political staffer, or obviously since I was lucky enough to join the National Caucus 20 years ago as a Member of Parliament from New Brunswick. The virtual convention is not the same feeling as seeing old friends and being with one another physically, but obviously it's the safe and appropriate way for us to continue this important tradition of our party at this difficult moment in our country's history. Votre énergie, votre engagement,
your energy and your commitment and your ideas
jamais de nous inspirer et nous motiver. Et j'ai l'immense privilège de servir comme député. Et c'est grâce à des personnes comme vous, à des bénévoles qui bâtissent un mouvement politique inclusif, progressiste et innovateur. My friends, our party is strong, our party is united, it's inclusive, but it's also dedicated to serving all Canadians and every part of our country. As Liberals, we've always debated ideas, as we have in the past few days, about how to build a resilient, sustainable economy, about how to effectively tackle issues as critical as climate change, and how to put a price on pollution, all essential to building a growing and prosperous and sustainable economy. Nous utilisons ces congrès, non pas pour nier, par exemple, l'existence même des changements climatiques, comme font les conservateurs, mais pour discuter des politiques, pour mieux protéger les Canadiens pendant des moments si difficiles et pour renouveler notre engagement fondamental de lutter, par exemple, contre les changements climatiques et bâtir une économie durable pour tout le monde. Our work these past days as Liberals has been focused squarely on Canadians, on how to support and protect all Canadians during these difficult moments, and how to lead Canada into a strong, sustainable, inclusive economic recovery that leaves nobody behind and leaves no region of our country behind. I never cease to be inspired and motivated by conventions like these. Liberals stick together and are united at the difficult moments our country has faced in the past and will always continue to draw strength from one another. Cet esprit d'équipe, cette unité que nous voyons ces derniers jours lors de notre congrès, ce sont les mêmes sentiments qui guident notre caucus et notre Conseil des ministres. Mr. O'Toole and the Conservatives, well, they have a different focus than us. They spend their time going in circles wondering whether or not climate change is real or how they can weaken the constitutional rights of women ou comment ils peuvent prétendre qu'ils sont en faveur des langues officielles tout en n'ayant pas le courage de dire qu'ils vont nommer des juges bilingues à la Cour suprême du Canada. The Conservatives even pretend recently they don't want an election. But I remember an evening a few weeks ago where they voted 8 times no confidence in the government. Rather bizarre behavior from people who don't want an election. Mr. O'Toole seems like a leader who wants to play chicken, always hoping somebody else swerves. Well, those aren't the qualities Canadians expect of a real leader. Nos amis au Bloc, ils sont des experts, comme dit souvent notre ami Pablo Rodriguez, ils sont des experts à essayer de fabriquer des chicanes, à essayer de prétendre que le gouvernement du Canada ne peut pas travailler avec les provinces pour aider et appuyer les Canadiens, même dans les moments les plus difficiles. Notre premier ministre, Justin Trudeau, a démontré clairement lors des 29 dernières réunions avec tous les premiers ministres des provinces et des territoires, et ça, juste depuis les 12 derniers mois. Il a démontré que notre gouvernement veut et peut travailler avec les gouvernements des provinces, y compris le gouvernement du Québec, dans l'intérêt des Canadiens. Il ne faut pas s'oublier que M. O'Toole, lui, faisait partie d'un gouvernement qui n'avait même pas le courage, pendant les 9 années qu'ils étaient au pouvoir, de rencontrer les premiers ministres des provinces et des territoires. I have been enormously privileged in my lifetime to know our leader and our prime minister since we were literally kids. In fact, I've known him most of my life. Our mothers were friends for over 40 years, and our dads were friends for over 50 years. When I was 14 years old, the Prime Minister's mother and father, in what, with hindsight, appears to be a moment of some worrisome judgment, asked me to babysit the then 10-year-old Justin, 8-year-old Sasha, and 6-year-old Michelle. So I was the one who led our collective efforts to play telephone jokes on our friends' parents, or ring doorbells and then run away and hide behind the bushes in the neighborhood where we lived in Ottawa. And family weekends spent together skiing at Mont-Tremblant when we were kids cemented a friendship for me, which has been important and enduring for my entire life. Justin Trudeau est véritablement le meilleur ami qu'on pourrait jamais avoir. C'est une personne extrêmement sensible, d'une grande générosité et de compassion. Il est aussi très drôle et extrêmement généreux avec son temps. Il est ouvert aux idées des autres et à comment aller chercher le meilleur de tout le monde. Ces liens d'amitié depuis si longtemps m'ont permis de voir de très proche une personne extraordinaire qui est devenue notre chef et ensuite le premier ministre du Canada. Et depuis les 12 dernières années que nous sommes des collègues au caucus et à la Chambre des communes, j'ai vu la discipline, l'énergie, l'éthique de travail et la rigueur si impressionnant de celui qui guide notre pays depuis les 5 dernières années. The Prime Minister's character and values are what make him the remarkable leader that he is. His love for his amazing wife, Sophie, and their 3 fantastic children is literally inspiring, as is his generosity and his kindness to his friends and to his colleagues. As some of you may know, I went through some difficult health challenges these last 3 years. One night, in the first couple of weeks of the last election, in the fall of 2019, I was in an isolation room at the Hôpital Maisonneuve-Rosemont in Montreal. I just received a stem cell transplant. When the nursing station got a call that the Prime Minister was on his way from the airport to the hospital. The Prime Minister arrived at the end of a long day of campaigning. He came to the hospital and spent over 2 hours with me. We laughed, we told stories, we talked about the election. And that simple gesture, I think, shows the character of the person who leads our country. And it certainly motivated me for the long weeks I had ahead of myself in that isolation room at the hospital in Montreal. And I will never, ever forget that gesture of friendship that the Prime Minister repeats so many times over and over again. These basic values of decency and caring and generosity translate into the work the Prime Minister does every day for Canadians. He never takes his focus off what the government can do for Canadians and how to build a more prosperous, inclusive, fair, and generous country. Our leader, unlike the Conservatives and the Bloc, believes the national government has a key role in playing to have Canadians' backs, particularly at a moment as difficult as the one we're in now. He says to us over and over again in caucus, in cabinet meetings, that we will do what we have to for as long as we have to protect Canadians, to protect their health, their safety, their economic well-being, and that of the Canadian economy as well. Alors, mes amis, c'est avec énormément de plaisir que je vous présente une courte vidéo et ensuite le Premier ministre prendra la parole. And now, Liberal friends, it's with enormous pride that I present a short video after which the Prime Minister will speak to us. Merci beaucoup.
One of my favorite Prime Ministers, Wilfrid Laurier, often talked about patriotism and the unifying power of common goals and aspirations. I've seen firsthand that there is so much more that unites us than divides us. We all want safer communities, a cleaner planet, and a good quality of life. We want this for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for our kids and grandkids. In the years ahead, our team will work hard to build on the progress made by the Canadians who came before us. We will champion Canada in all its diversity. We will give voice to the voiceless. And in every decision we make as your government, we will always put this country and its people first.
La pandémie a officiellement un an. Le 11 mars 2020 marquera toujours un avant et un après. Pour les familles et pour les proches, chaque décès a aussi un avant et un après. But even as COVID-19 took hold of our planet, even as this new word took over our lives, we found ourselves talking about other words, too. About words that weren't new at all. Sacrifice and solidarity, compassion and community. When the pandemic hit last year, these words that have defined Canadians for generations, were suddenly given new meaning.
The fact is, there's never been a more important time to be involved. We've now hosted 9 different virtual weekends of action, the first of their kind, and made more than 1 million calls to check in with our neighbors and hear their ideas and priorities. En tant que gouvernement, notre priorité absolue est d'assurer la sécurité de tous. Peu importe qui vous êtes, où vous vivez, vous pouvez compter sur nous. Je compte à mon tour sur vous pour veiller à ce que, aujourd'hui comme demain, nous visions ce qu'il y a de mieux, parce que votre participation et votre soutien sont au cœur de notre succès. We've seen Canadians step up to be there for each other. We've watched this happen in big ways and small ways in every community across the country. And that coming together has given us the gift of perspective and the reminder of how important it is to have each other's backs in difficult times.
From March through October, the CERB alone supported 8.9 million Canadians. We have invested in healthcare, increased testing and tracing, and directly supported provinces and territories as they fight the virus. This has been a Team Canada effort.
Mais je veux être très clair avec les Canadiens. Notre objectif, c'est de faire en sorte que la PCU fonctionne pour vous. Notre gouvernement va continuer d'être là pour vous. There is nothing we won't do to keep you safe and to protect your health.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, Liberals. Dominic, first off, thank you for that introduction. My friend, I can't tell you how happy I am to have you on this team, especially with everything you've been through in the past few years. Even through those health challenges, we knew we could count on you. Your humor, your dedication, your political insights have been extraordinary, and it is so important to have you back at this table, especially in the thick of this crisis. Thank you for all that you do for Canadians, Dom, and for this Liberal movement. And to each of you who is tuning in this weekend, it's so good to have you join us at our 2021 convention.
I know that well over half of you are first-time delegates. To everyone who is new, welcome. Thanks for stepping up. And to everyone else, it's great to be gathered with you all once again, even virtually. Que ce soit votre premier congrès ou non, les choses sont bien différentes cette année. Quand on était tous ensemble à Halifax en 2018, personne n'aurait pensé que notre prochain congrès serait un congrès virtuel. Peu importe d'où vous vous connectez, mes amis, je suis très content d'être ici avec vous. On va se le dire, l'année a été difficile. On connaît tous des familles qui ont perdu un être cher à cause du virus. On connaît tous quelqu'un qui n'a pas pu faire ses adieux à un grand-parent, un parent ou un ami. Within our own Liberal family, just this fall, we lost a true grit and former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable John Napier Turner. John was not just a good friend, a gifted athlete, and an exceptional politician. He was a remarkable leader who brought people together with his vision for a Canada brimming with hope for the future. And this year, maybe more than ever, I think we've all realized just how powerful that idea can be. Because forced isolation taught us new ways to connect with our friends and neighbors and be there for each other. A global crisis showed that local, individual actions really matter. And a faceless virus allowed us to better see the faces that have been there for us all. The brave nurses I spoke to last month at Victoria General in Winnipeg, the vaccine clinic staff I met in Montreal, and the frontline caregivers I Zoomed with at a retirement home in St. John. The communities celebrating holidays virtually, the PPE drives, the groceries left on porches for neighbors, and Liberals like you. In the last year, this team has truly stepped up. I think of Dr. Doug Ailson, past and future Liberal MP, who is in the meantime caring for ICU patients during this pandemic. Or current MP Kamal Khera, who went back to help as a nurse at long-term care home during the first wave and is now administering vaccines. However you've helped, and I know a lot of you have connected with Canadians on phone calls and during weekends of action, you remind us that when we talk about hope and hard work, when we talk about sunny ways, we're talking about you. Ensemble, on a accompli beaucoup de choses depuis 5 ans, et juste dans la dernière année, on en a fait énormément. Mais le travail est loin d'être terminé. Pendant qu'on lutte pour en finir avec la pandémie, et on est dans les derniers mois, on l'espère, il faut se préparer pour ce qui vient après. Et nous, au Parti libéral, on sait qu'un gouvernement doit travailler pour tout le monde, pour tous les parents, tous les travailleurs, toutes les petites entreprises, tous les jeunes et toutes les personnes âgées. Recently, I spoke to Najma and Karim. They're parents and small business owners from Toronto who'd written to me about what it's like not just to raise a family during a pandemic, but to run a restaurant, too. As Najma shared, it's really tough. Karim and Najma work hard. They put their heart and soul into building their restaurant from the ground up. They gave back to their community. In other words, they did everything right. They couldn't have planned for a global pandemic, and they shouldn't have to face one alone. When times got tougher than they could ever have expected, when the regular lunch crowd they rely on started working from home, they needed a government that would have their back, that listened to the real challenges they face, and then put in place real support. Because at the end of the day, that's what politics should be about. Real solutions to real problems. I know that's why I got into politics a dozen years ago, and I know that's why you've joined in, too. So what does having people's backs look like? What does that mean for Najma and Karim? Well, it means that instead of worrying about the rent on their restaurant, they could count on the rent subsidy to bridge them through this crisis. It means that instead of laying people off because they couldn't make payroll, they were able to keep their employees on the job with the wage subsidy. And it means that instead of losing sleep over the cost of raising a family, they were able to use the Canada Child Benefit to buy school supplies like the tablet their kids need for classes from home. La dernière année a été difficile pour Najma et Karim, et pour bien d'autres familles et propriétaires de petites entreprises. Mais comme l'a dit Najma, tout soutien qui aide à traverser cette tempête est comme un rayon d'espoir à travers les nuages. Ce qu'on fait, on le fait pour des gens comme Karim et Najma. Et on va continuer d'être là pour tous les Canadiens. My friends, here's the thing. There are over 400,000 kids who were lifted out of poverty these past years with programs like the Canada Child Benefit. Well, when some of them are at risk of going hungry again because of this pandemic, that means there's still work to do. Across the country, there are seniors who have the secure retirement they deserve because we increased the guaranteed income supplement. But too many of them didn't get the care they needed in their seniors' home this spring, so there's still work to do. And to the Asian Canadians, Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and people living with disabilities who make this country stronger, to the LGBTQ2 communities and the racialized communities and the faith communities that make Canada richer, when anyone, anywhere, faces racism, discrimination, or hatred, when anyone, anywhere, feels the weight not just of this pandemic, but of inequity and injustice, there's still work to do. Mes amis, quand il y a des obstacles devant nous, que ce soit en lien avec la pandémie, l'ALENA ou tous les autres défis qu'on relève ensemble, notre équipe libérale est toujours claire par rapport aux valeurs qu'on défend. On est là pour les Canadiens. On est là pour la classe moyenne et ceux qui travaillent fort pour s'y joindre. Et on va toujours avoir un plan progressiste pour bâtir une économie forte et propre qui fonctionne pour tous. As liberals, we know what real change means. Because what this team knows is that finding real solutions means addressing the real challenges people face. And that's something that Erin O'Toole's Conservative Party just can't quite grasp. How disconnected do you have to be to admit that you would have cut CERB, a lifeline for millions of people, during the worst economic crisis in a century? How disconnected do you have to be to call young people lazy when their summer jobs disappeared because of a global pandemic? How disconnected do you have to be to flirt with disinformation on public health and vaccines while a deadly virus takes loved ones, friends, and neighbors? And how disconnected do you have to be to refuse to admit climate change is real, even as people's basements flood and wildfires tear through communities? The problem for Erin O'Toole is that he's not interested in real solutions to real problems. In fact, he's already shown that he's willing to say different things to different people at different times if he thinks it'll help him get ahead. He says he wants to make communities safer, but to get the support of the gun lobby, he promised to make assault weapons legal again. He says he defends a woman's right to choose, but to win the Conservative Party leadership, he told his MPs they could introduce anti-choice laws. When I first ran for Liberal leader, I said that the debate over a woman's right to choose was finished. So we made sure you could only be a Liberal candidate if you agreed to protect that right. In 2015, we laid out our plan for a stronger middle class. Well, the first thing we did after that election was to cut taxes for the middle class by raising them on the wealthiest 1%. In 2019, we promised even stronger gun control. And last year, we banned assault weapons. And at the start of this crisis, we told Canadians we would have your back. So we rolled out CERB, we created the wage subsidy, we invested in schools, in healthcare, and in vaccines. In fact, on vaccines, while Erin O'Toole's Conservatives gleefully told Canadians it might be years until they got their shot, the reality is very different. Minister Anand and the Liberal team surpassed our promise of 6 million vaccines by the end of March, and by the end of last week, we got to 9.5 million doses. There are millions more vaccines on the way, and we're on track to meet our commitment that every Canadian who wants to will be fully vaccinated by the end of the summer. Dans notre équipe libérale, on n'attend pas pour passer de la parole à l'action. Quand vient le temps de mettre de l'avant des idées progressistes, on ne tourne pas autour du pot, on agit. Beaucoup de gens ne le savent pas, mais quand on compte tout le soutien fourni aux Canadiens depuis le début de la pandémie, c'est 8 $ sur 10 qui proviennent de notre gouvernement. En d'autres mots, 80% de l'argent qui sert à aider les gens à traverser la crise est fourni par le gouvernement fédéral. L'année dernière, plus de 8 millions de personnes ont eu recours à de l'aide financière fédérale pour payer leur loyer et mettre de la nourriture sur la table. Et on a déployé les forces armées et la Croix-Rouge canadienne dans les CHSLD pour aider nos personnes âgées les plus vulnérables. Tout ça, ça a le mérite de mettre les choses très au clair. Pendant que le Bloc fait semblant d'être le seul parti qui peut parler au nom des Québécois, nous, on livre la marchandise pour les Québécois avec de l'aide directe pour les aînés, les entreprises, les familles et les travailleurs. Quand vient le temps de livrer pour les Québécois, ça prend des Québécois au gouvernement. Nous, les libéraux, on prend des mesures historiques pour promouvoir et protéger le français, pas seulement au Québec, mais partout à travers le Canada. Et on est le seul parti qui a un vrai plan pour s'attaquer au changement climatique et pour léguer un avenir plus propre et plus prospère à nos enfants. Dans notre plan, on interdit les plastiques à usage unique. On protège 25% des océans et des terres du Canada pendant qu'on plante 2 milliards d'arbres et on atteint la cible de zéro émission nette d'ici 2050. On préfère choisir l'action au lieu de la division. On est toujours là pour les Québécois et pour tous les Canadiens et on va continuer d'avoir un message rassembleur au lieu de chercher la chicane. My friends, what it all comes down to is this. Which party has a real plan for the real problems in the real world? Some refuse to accept reality, all while offering falsehoods and division. Us? Well, this team is focused on solutions to the challenges we face, from health to jobs, from human rights to the environment. This team is focused on building back better for the middle class and people working hard to join it, while taking climate action to create good jobs and keep our economy growing for years to come. In other words, our team is focused on a better future for all Canadians. Les militants libéraux comme vous, vous avez toujours été là pour ouvrir la voie quand est venu le temps de réfléchir aux grands enjeux et d'agir. Ça a été le cas pour le droit égal au mariage et pour la légalisation du cannabis. Vous avez tenu votre bout, même quand le Parti conservateur s'attaquait à ces mesures. D'ailleurs, avec le Parti conservateur, on voit bien que plus ça change, plus c'est pareil. Pendant leur congrès, ils ont refusé de reconnaître que les changements climatiques sont réels. Contrairement à ça, vous, depuis le début, vous avez toujours continué de pousser pour faire avancer les choses. Au cours de la dernière année, vous avez demandé à plus d'1 million de Canadiens leurs idées pour bâtir un avenir meilleur. Et aujourd'hui, au plus grand congrès politique du Parti libéral de tous les temps, on intègre ces idées à notre plan. My friends, You've always been the heart of our liberal movement. On the big things that are still ahead, just like on everything we've already done, I know I can count on you to remind us that better is always possible. Because I know that you'll be there with your energy, your positivity, and above all, your conviction that together we can create an even better country to call home. The conversations we've had this weekend, the policy debates ongoing, the ideas we've shared, this is not just about policy. This is about people. It's about parents like Najma and Kareem. In Kareem's words, he came to Canada to build a good life for his kids and to give back to this country. That was what he dreamed of. And that's what so many parents dream of. It's about kids who can feel excited for their future and one day build a life for themselves in a clean, thriving economy. And it's about neighbors and friends who will each have a real and fair chance at success. Les prochains temps seront pas toujours faciles. Mais malgré tout, on reste optimiste avec une vision positive pour l'avenir. On continue de travailler pour que les petites entreprises reviennent en force, pour que plus de familles puissent s'acheter une première maison et pour que nos communautés soient plus sécuritaires et plus en santé. Together, we get to choose a brighter future. Together, we get to grab hold of a once-in-a-generation moment to build the kind of tomorrow we all want to see. So reach out your hand to a neighbor who had a blue or orange or green lawn sign last time around. Phone up a friend who has a different perspective and maybe didn't vote for us in the past. Perhaps they're feeling disenchanted. Perhaps they're feeling left behind because they know climate change is real. Tell them about the plan that together this Liberal team is building with hope and hard work. And then, and this is important, listen to the things that they need us to do even better. In this past year, we've all been each other's neighbors. If anyone ever doubted it, COVID-19 has shown us that we're always stronger together. When we're there for each other, when we lean on each other, when we listen to each other. So the partisanship that's far too often the norm in Ottawa, we know that's not who Canadians are. We are people who get that we're in this together. People who understand that even when we're doing okay, if our neighbor is struggling, we're all worse off. Who understand that when all of our kids have a chance at success, when all of our entrepreneurs have an opportunity to thrive, when all of our communities have clean air and clean water, the future is brighter for all of us. The future is brighter for each of us. Ensemble, on traverse une crise sans précédent. Et ensemble, on se prépare à bâtir un avenir qui va être meilleur que tout ce qu'on a connu avant. Il y a de meilleurs jours qui nous attendent et je sais qu'ensemble, on va y arriver. Merci, mes chers amis. Thank you so much, dear friends.
Okay, so we heard what the Liberals had to say, but as we've heard, the Liberals have had trouble with hidden agendas and not being forthcoming with us as citizens, telling us what it is that they're really trying to do and coming out to us and just simply saying, hey, look at all the great things that we did, when maybe all they did was put a Band-Aid to things. We are grateful for things like the CERB and SEBA that have helped, but they haven't come up with any permanent solutions to the problems that the pandemic and that 2020 handed us the real social problems behind it. They still haven't come up with a policy to ensure that a pipeline will not drive itself across British Columbia and destroy landscapes and leak poisonous bitumen into wildlife reserves and interrupt caribou runs and things. So we need to look and make sure that we are holding all elected officials accountable. So with that, I'm going to leave with this last thing. There is a Green Party town hall that we recorded, and it is about saving ancient forests, and most everything is based back in British Columbia. So thank you for listening today, and listen to what the Green Party has in this town hall about ancient forests and trying to save our environment.
Here we go. Sorry about that, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us here tonight. My name is Yonina Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Green Party, and I'm at the moment multitasking, reading messages as I'm also introducing this wonderful and most important event here tonight. I would like to begin by doing a land acknowledgement, but I want to begin by acknowledging that we gather here tonight on ceded and unceded territories across British Columbia. But I'm also really aware that acknowledgements are only part of what we need to be doing here tonight, that we also need to be talking about what actions we're going to take. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting on this myself personally. There was a time when we thought that acknowledgements were what we needed to do, but what we really need to do is also be reflecting on what actions we're going to take towards reconciliation. So tonight, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, and then as a witness to tonight, and I encourage you as well to reflect on what actions that you can take away and go out and make a change for as a commitment towards reconciliation on issues around old growth and others as well. So it's with gratitude that I get to moderate and MC tonight. This is a town hall on old growth. We will be discussing the impacts of the report that has come forward and the commitment by the BC NDP in the election to implement all the recommendations in the report, and where we are today with the call for them to do that. We have a fantastic panel here for you tonight, which I will introduce as we go through the evening. And we will have some special videos as well to show you. So we're going to start with one of those videos. The video is going to be shown by Dr. Rachel Holt. Rachel Holt is an independent ecologist based in Nelson, British Columbia. Rachel has worked on the ecology and management of old growth forests from many angles over the last 25 years. From defining indices of old growth in the field in the 1990s to policy planning, cumulative effects assessments for the province of BC and First Nations in a wide variety of ecosystems. She will provide a brief overview of the state of old forests in BC based on a recent report undertaken by herself and two colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Holt.
Hello. My name is Dr. Rachel Holt, and I've been asked to give a brief overview of some recent work that some colleagues and I have undertaken to look at the state of old forests in BC. British Columbia is vast, 95 million hectares, larger than lots of European countries, and highly diverse. Almost half of the area is non-forested, alpine grassland ecosystems, and the rest is a huge variety of different types of forested ecosystems. We have an ecosystem classification system that describes all that ecological variability. And as a result, when the Old Growth Strategic Review Panel was announced a couple of years ago, I was very surprised to see that the only statistic on the state of old forests was this one. There was no additional information provided to underpin their work except this generic number, that there's 13.2 million hectares of old forest in the province, representing about 23% of forested ecosystems. Myself, along with two colleagues, Karen Price and Dave Doust, both also independent ecologists and foresters, decided that this was insufficient to understand or to inform that process. And so we went about doing our own analysis. We used provincially available data on forest cover, and we combined it with that ecosystem classification system. And we also combined it with a look at the productivity of sites. Site index measures how fast trees grow, and it's a common metric used in forest management. So we combined these things, and this is a brief overview of our results. So this gives us the picture of what all the trees in British Columbia look like. The province says that there's 13 million hectares of old growth, and we agree. And it's shown in green here on this map. However, once we start to zoom in on the most productive areas, on a highest site index sites, then we start to see that there's much less old forest, and the proportion of old forest decreases. And once we're in this high end of the range on the most productive sites, we have very little old forest remaining, so little you basically can't see it on this map. This graphic shows the numerical output in a different way. So on the left, you have the least productive ecosystems, and on the right-hand end, you have the most productive ecosystems. The size of the circle represents the land area in each of the site index or productivity classes. So the larger the circle, the more area falls into that category. And the green slice shows you what proportion of it is old. A couple of things obviously to note. In the lowest productivity classes, you have more old forest. And as you move towards the right, in the highest productivity classes, you have a very small proportion of old. In fact, of that 13.2 million hectares of green old forest on this graphic, 80% of it falls in these two low and very low productivity classes. So that represents high elevation forests, bog forests, and otherwise forests that grow small trees. Conversely, on the other side of the productivity range, this area, the amount of green that falls in these categories, as you can see, the actual area of high productivity land is relatively low in the province. And that's not surprising if you think about valley bottom ecosystems, the most productive places. They're actually a small proportion of the total area. And in addition, the sliver of green that is in each of those is very low. So of the remaining old total, about 3% of it falls in these highest productivity classes. So when people say there's 13.2 million hectares of old forest, they are equating the forest on the left with the forest on the right. And clearly from every value, these things they're very different, ecologically, functionally, in terms of carbon storage, in terms of spiritual values, pretty much in every single way you can imagine. These should not be considered as one type of thing. They are very different. So our report concludes that there's something a little over 415,000 hectares of old forest remaining on these highest productivity sites. And that represents less than 1% of BC's total forest area of 50 million hectares. BC's biggest old forests are extremely rare, and many of them have so little remaining, 1 or 2% remaining. Some of these old forest ecosystems may already be effectively extirpated. One example I would suggest would be the Douglas fir. Douglas fir dominated ecosystems of the coast. What was once there really doesn't exist anymore. And there are other examples. So don't we have policy to protect these forests? Well, we do have policy, but we have evidence from multiple sources that suggests that that policy is ineffective at multiple scales. We have a system of protected areas that's highly skewed towards high alpine and low productivity ecosystems. We have retention targets for old forest, but the targets themselves are very low in comparison to the natural amount of old forest that would be in ecosystems. And that means that they represent a high risk situation. And in addition, many of the old growth management areas in the province actually don't contain old forest. For example, a provincial report in the Kootenays showed that less than 20% of the forest in old growth management areas was not in fact old, even though old forest existed. And in addition, the original policy, lots of it was never implemented at all. For example, we don't manage for mature forests, so recruitment old in much of the province. The connectivity requirements were never implemented, and nor was a look at finer scale ecosystems. In fact, the policy is focused on timber and not, in fact, on the biodiversity values it's supposed to be maintaining. And in particular, these are examples from the current policy. We have a timber cap, and we have words throughout the policy that says they can be implemented, but without unduly reducing the timber supply. And as a result of that, we actually end up retaining, saving the other end of the spectrum. We go out of our way to not maintain the most valuable areas of old forests in the province. So in summary, big old forests were always relatively rare naturally, but today only a tiny fraction remains of the historic levels. And we do not have effective policy to protect or restore the best of the remaining old forests across the range of BC's forested ecosystems. Our report is available online, and it's also just in press with the Canadian Journal of Forest Management, so it can be found on their website as well. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Yonina.
Thank you. I've got so many things open here. I'm so sorry. You know, you always get a good chuckle off everybody else doing that, and then you end up doing it yourself. So my apologies. Thank you so much for that very informative presentation. And, you know, it's going to be a lot that we can build off on our conversation here tonight. I'm going to introduce our next two panelists. Here we have one person who needs really no introduction on this call, our party leader, Sonia Furstenau, who is also MLA for Cowichan Valley. I want to just start by saying a lot of you know a lot about Sonia's work, but I want to personally just acknowledge the leadership that Sonia has shown, not just on this issue here in Old Growth, but it demonstrates the approach that she is taking as a leader of our party to be solutions-based, to be able to put people first, to put our environment and climate change first, and to take care of the needs of both of those. And it's been an absolute pleasure to support that work as a party that Adam and Sonia are doing in the Ledge. And so it's my deep pleasure to introduce her here tonight as one of our esteemed panelists. Alongside her is Andy McKinnon, who ran as one of our candidates in the 2020 SNAP election, you'll remember well. Andy McKinnon is a forest ecologist who lives in Metchosin, BC. Since December 2014, he's also served as a councillor in Metchosin. Until his retirement in 2015, he worked for the BC Forest Service for 3 decades, mostly on BC's coast, where he was responsible for ecosystem classification and mapping and a program of forest ecology research focused on old growth structure and composition, effects on climate change, and BC's native plants and fungi. So it's my opportunity now to give them a chance to speak to you about what the most important things we need to do to protect old growth. And while I do that, might I just frame, Sonia and Andy, that several of the questions that came in during the video presentation were asking for clarifications on what is old growth, what do we mean by productive? So perhaps you can allude to that in your responses in your conversation. After you have a chance to chat, I will facilitate a Q&A between yourselves.
Thank you, Yonina, and I'll begin by acknowledging I'm on Coast Salish lands, the territories of Cowichan tribes and Malahoot Nation. Very delighted to be here with many of my favorite people this evening, and really glad to have it looks like over 700 people joining us this evening. And before I throw it over to Andy, I just want to pause for a moment, because we can get into these discussions and policy and numbers and what's happening. And I think when it comes to the conversation around old growth, I think if all of us can take a moment, and I expect that for almost everybody who's watching tonight, you've been in a forest, in an ancient forest, and you know what it feels like to be in an ancient forest with a giant tree next to you, with so much life around you, so much diversity of life around you that you can't even really tell where one living thing begins and the next ends. I was in the Fairy Creek watershed 2 weekends ago, and it, of course, stirred what always happens to me when I go into these forests, which is this incredible reverence and awe for these amazing creatures that are being cut down because they have this value, this timber value. And we look at other amazing creatures around the world, rhinoceroses and tigers and elephants, who are also being cut down for their value. And we recognize that that is wrong, that we owe something to these ancient creatures. And I just wanted to kind of locate us in that place of being in a forest, of being near these trees, which are wondrous and amazing, and as we just heard from Rachel, incredibly rare. And with that, I'll let Andy introduce himself, and then we'll start with our conversation.
Thank you, Sonia. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Chinook people in Metchosin, British Columbia, and I thank them for allowing us to meet and have this great evening on their territory. One of the questions that was raised here in the chat room was, how are we defining old growth forests? And I think in all of the reports, in all of the government legislation so far, it begins with the definition of age class, which is something that's in the forest inventory and is generally used as 250 plus on the coast and 140 plus for most forest types in interior British Columbia, though there are exceptions. But as Rachel emphasized, if you simply use that definition, you end up comparing apples and oranges, or apples and kumquats, more to the point. I think I've been invited tonight because I'm really old, not as old as some of these forested stands, but old enough to have been involved with the development of British Columbia's old growth strategy in the early 1990s. And I was the chair of the research and inventory group, and we came up with a variety of different definitions at the time, and you could still come up with a variety of different definitions today. And we were dealing with the same problem in the early 1990s that people are dealing with today. That if you simply use an H-class definition, the government and industry in unison can say with a straight face, relax, there's lots left. And I was really hoping that we had moved beyond that with the last stands report that Rachel talked about and the British Columbia's old growth panel report, both of whom used the province's own forest cover inventory data to make these important distinctions between productive old growth forests, productive in terms of being able to grow big trees quickly, and the vast majority of the forests which just can't. And because, we decided in the early 1990s, for example, we decided working with the land use plan for Great Bear Rainforest, that it would be very simple to protect 90% of British Columbia's central coast, put it in protected areas without having any impact at all on timber supply. You could apply that to the entire province. People aren't fighting over these high elevation or bog forests. They're fighting over these valley bottom productive forests, which are the areas that are important ecologically, recreationally, and for their timber values. And I was really hoping we'd been beyond that until I watched Sonia in the legislature week before last, I think, questioning the Minister of Forests, and she answered the same way that government and industry were answering in the early 1990s. She said, relax, there's lots left. And it's just so frustrating to see government having promised so much and clearly on track to deliver so little. Anyway, I've said too much. Over to you, Sonia.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.